The X series isn't very well known for its storylines. The first game had a nice and self-contained story, and X4 brought some actually interesting stuff to the table worth mentioning. But I think the most underrated of them all is, yes, the one from the 6th game, the original version that is, as the official localization is less than stellar, to say the least. I can point out many issues with the stories of X2 and X3, but the one thing I'd like to note is, have you ever known that Gravity Beetle is Boomer Granger's brother? Well, you wouldn't know that from the game because those games didn't focus on the story much at all. That's an interesting detail that separates him from the rest. X4 tried to solve the issue by introducing dialogues with nearly every boss character, but only a few of them got the chance to have their dialogues be anything more than mere filler, with the only one of the 8 bosses who got that being Magma Dragoon. X6, however, decides to change this. Since none of Gate's investigators are under the control of any virus, each of them gets a ton of unique dialogues to show off their traits and ambitions. From Yanmark still being paranoid about the incident, to Maginian getting incredibly mad about you destroying his precious Illumina. Those dialogues make the 8 bosses more than just mere animal fodder. They're unique characters in their own right. Minor characters, but memorable for their voice clips, lines, and even attack animations. This is something I don't really see much in other games. Aside from some rare exceptions, most of the Zero and ZX series treats their Mutos Reploids and Pseudoroids as just a bunch of fodder. Except this time they can't shut up about how old Zero is, which gets boring really quickly. There are exceptions. For one, Zero 2 actually has a brotherly relationship between the Beetles in-game. Unfortunately, those cases are far too few and far between, and in some cases like the 8 smug pricks from Zero 3, you'll only find out that they had an interesting personality if you look for outside content, as they're just veiled pawns in-game. What also works in this game's story is X's characterization. We all know how X7 made X a little too pacifistic, whiny even, while on the other hand, X8 also has X already just assume that everyone is a maverick and go into fighting mode without much thought, as the bosses themselves are similarly disinterested in having a dialogue. In X6, however, we see something different, a balance. X is willing to fight, but he legitimately tries his best to find a peaceful way out with most of the bosses he fights. He's concerned about the safety of others, which includes even the main antagonist, Gate, as X ends up saving him after battle, even if it's unlikely Gate will survive. A balance of both his pacifism and heroism is great. Aelia, the mediocre navigator character from the previous game, gains an actual importance and conflict with a complete backstory and connection to the game's events, as she has just as much things to talk with the antagonist as X or Zero do to the events of the past. Once that X6 actually bothers to detail in-game as you learn about the past lives of the investigators and Gate. With this, I'd like to mention before talking about Gate himself a certain part of X6's story that many hate, the Sigma hijack. Actually, what Sigma hijack? Sigma's a joke in X6. Whether he's here because the developers felt like being meta about how much his character degraded, or just to finish him off for real, as this is the first time in the series where the final boss has protagonists towering over him, unlike the usual way things go. Sigma doesn't nullify the other antagonist. It is Gate who appears throughout most of the game. It is Gate who causes the nightmare incident, and it is Gate who gets to be in the game's ending. Was he under the influence of the Zero virus? Possibly. But the game does mention that he swore vengeance upon his colleagues way before the colony incident, so that already gives him more agency than almost any other antagonist of the X series. That's why Gate works. Even if Sigma did end up hijacking the show for a short period of time, it's way less of a problem when we get to see and understand Gate throughout most of the game otherwise. He has a presence throughout most of the game's cutscenes, he has a unique style, and he's a refreshing antagonist, taking inspiration from Wily's backstory of the classic series, but with more time to actually show him off as a character rather than just as a bad guy to be, to make sure he's not just another Doppler. Gate was a genius inventor, possibly the best of his time, and his creations led to large progress in their fields, along with helping out heavily with restoring the Earth. But both out of jealousy and fear, the colleagues he trusted, including Aelia, who despite not agreeing with the idea, still participated in it, having decided to kill off his creations. Living beings who we get to see in their revived forms throughout the game. Gate's work was never appreciated. Instead, he was punished and betrayed, making for a rather sympathetic villain. However, he is not the redeemable kind of villain. Despite noble intentions at first and technical prowess, even before the incident, he was delusional enough to not care about people's lives out of his personal hatred for those who betrayed him. And even though the hunters wanted him to stop and help them restore the world, he simply refuses to because ultimately, he really isn't a good person. This to me is how you do a good villain. Motivation and backstory, yes, but he's still not just misguided, he's a cackling maniac. Over all else, he is really entertaining, especially thanks to Keiji Fujiwara's brilliant voice. May he, Mr. Keiji, rest in peace. And yes, Isaac is wily. Not like that's the only time this game references the classic series, but indeed, he is wily. Does that matter? Not really. Isaac does serve a similar role to Wily. He's the obviously evil but fun and goofy antagonist, except here he's in the role of a henchman. And hey, his death references the Soul Eraser incident, which is a nice continuity nod. Hey, just to mention, did you know that among the many common misconceptions about X6, one of them is that it continues from a mix of X5's endings? No, it doesn't. It continues from the good one, because surprise, the Earth is heavily damaged by X5's events no matter what ending you get. It's only just clarified if you take down the Eurasia colony with Enigma Cannon specifically. Why? I don't know. That said, the reason why I mentioned this is because I'm of the opinion that X5 does a worse job story-wise than X6, despite having similar goals and approaches. Many of the boss characters have their agency taken away by the magical Sigma virus, while the new characters such as Aelia end up being used in the worst ways possible, with more useless hints than actual dialogue to establish them all, while even Dynamo gets at least something compared to the new Maverick Hunter team, all ending in a surprisingly anticlimactic rendition of the long built-up battle between X and Zero. Oh, and Sigma's back as the main antagonist. But, you might say, X6 wasn't meant to happen. Inafune intended X5 to be the ending. Well, yes, X5's endings, among trying to tie itself to Legends, also ended the entire X series. Does that mean you can't make a good, hell, even better story after that? No, because no Sonic games were meant to happen past Adventure 2, no Zero or ZX games were meant to happen past Zero 3, no Metal Gear games were meant to happen past either Metal Gear Solid or Solid 3 depending when you ask Kojima about it, and so on and so forth. Just because there's a word of God, quote-unquote, doesn't mean much, especially since, despite common belief, Inafune was barely even involved in X5 to begin with, being a mere special thanks. It definitely shows, as there are many things that the X games of this era share in game design, art style, and most importantly, story approach. In my opinion, X6 definitely does a far better job at all of that than X5, and hell, some things better than almost any other Mega Man game. But I'd like to mention that it's interesting that there's even a conversation like this. While I haven't played any of those games as a child, this era of X game is what I see the X series as. They're my personal favorites, and ones that I find the most interesting. However, it's true that Capcom hasn't really cared for consistency with this series. Despite my problems with the Super Nintendo games, there are many people who love those far more, and trying for those people to have an entire area of the series that just isn't what they love. Similar to classic and modern Sonic, for example. The reason I've decided to make those videos is to present my point of view, and hopefully making more people give those games a chance or just form their own opinions, so there can be discussions about them. Whether you like them or not, I'll be glad to read what you think in the comments. Have fun!